I should introduce myself to you, although it is said that I am the most famous nurse in history, and I've already seen that you've drawn such marvellous pictures of me. Thank you ever so much for those. I am, of course, Florence Nightingale, the lady with the lamp. I was born in 1820 in Florence in Italy. My mamma and papa travelled throughout Europe after they got married, and when they visited the city of Florence, they loved it so much that they named me after it. Now that was actually most unusual, because at the time Florence was a little boy's name, not a little girl's name. Thank you very much, mamma and papa. When I was just a year old, I returned to England with my family, my mamma, papa, and my sister Parthenope. Now, would you believe it, but as a child, I was in fact incredibly shy. But although I was incredibly shy, I was also incredibly clever, so much so that my papa taught me 5 languages, and he taught me philosophy and history, not the subjects usually taught to little girls. And so I had a little boy's name and a little boy's education. But other than my studies, which I adored, I remember my childhood as being out in the fields, playing with my wonderful animals, because I have had some rather incredible pets. I have always loved animals. Do you? I've always loved looking after them. In fact, you would often find me working with a cat tied round my neck in a knot. Oh, I've had some wonderful pets in my time. But perhaps my favourite companion of all was my dear pet owl Athena. Oh, lovely Athena. I found her in Athens and took her under my wing, so to speak. She was a bit fierce at first, but we became the best of friends, so much so that she travelled around with me everywhere I went in my pocket. I've always loved caring for animals. As a little girl, I loved caring for my dolls, and as I grew older, I would look after my own family. And then it came to me. I know what I want to do with my life. I love looking after things. I should become a nurse and care for the sick. Now, what do you think my parents thought about me becoming a nurse? Well, I can tell you they weren't very happy about it at all. They didn't like the idea of me, an educated woman from a wealthy background, going and working in a hospital. Hospitals at the time were seen as incredibly dirty places, and nursing was not seen as a good job. But I was determined, and so I read every book that I could find on the subject. I went to visit hospitals near where I lived in Derbyshire, and I went across to Europe, and I visited hospitals there and helped out. But it was in 1847 when I was in Rome. Has anybody been to Rome? It's a wonderful city in Italy. It was in Rome that I met the fantastic and brilliant politician Sidney Herbert. Sidney Herbert was in Rome with his beautiful wife. And when we met, oh, we got on so well, and in fact he was incredibly interested in everything that I was doing, so much so that when I came back to England, he introduced me to some very important people who by then had come to know that I was the expert on hospitals and nursing. And then in 1854 something happened. A war broke out, the Crimean War. Turkey and Russia were at war, and England and France went out to support Turkey in the fight against Russia. So many soldiers were involved in that war, and in fact 30,000 British soldiers went across to the Crimea. The boats were so full of soldiers, in fact, that there was little room for anything else. There was not enough room for the medical supplies and other things that those soldiers should need if they were to become injured in the war. A week after they arrived, the British and the French soldiers won the Battle of the Alma, but the wounded soldiers paid the price, because there wasn't enough equipment to look after them, and there was no proper place for them to go, and so the wounded soldiers lay on the floor in a farmyard, and there they had operations like amputations on the back of old doors used as makeshift tables, with nothing to numb the pain. And there was a terrible sickness called cholera, which weakened the soldiers that were already suffering from their injuries. Now, as the war went on, many of the soldiers were taken to the hospital at Scutari in Turkey, but I read in the Times newspapers that there was a shortage of doctors and medicine and bandages. In fact, some soldiers were lying in corridors on the floor, often left for weeks without anybody to look after them. Then, on the 15th of October in 1854, I received a letter from my dear friend Sidney Herbert, the politician, who had now become Secretary at War. And in that letter he asked, would I go out and help at Scutari Hospital? Of course I accepted. Now was my chance to follow my ambition. So off I went with my team of nurses, 38 in total, 24 of whom were nuns, and only 14 had had experience in a hospital before. We set off on the 21st of October in 1854. Oh, the voyage was incredibly rough, and I got incredibly seasick. But when we arrived, the doctors weren't pleased to see us at all. For after all, they thought, what could a young lady possibly know or do to help? They thought that we would just get in the way. But I was determined, and as the bitter winter drew in, I knew my work was about to begin in earnest. When we arrived, it was far worse than we could have possibly imagined. The hospital was completely filthy. The drains were blocked, the toilets were overflowing, there were rats running around, and the place smelt absolutely awful. Now, I have always believed in cleanliness, and so we started to clean, and it wasn't an easy task. We unblocked the drains, we removed 556 handcarts and large baskets full of rubbish, 24 dead animals and 2 horses were buried. We lime-washed the walls, and we opened the windows to let in the fresh air. And as we cleaned, I could see an improvement in the soldiers. I had to write several letters to England to my friend Sidney Herbert to ask for more supplies, because we needed more bed linen, more bandages, more medicine, and we desperately needed to improve the diet for the soldiers because they weren't getting enough vitamins and minerals, which meant many of them were getting an awful illness called scurvy, which caused some of their toes to fall off. And as we began to make improvements in the hospital, we thought the worst was over. But suddenly, an illness swept through the hospital, and over a period of 3 weeks, 4 doctors and 3 nurses also died. Something was terribly wrong, and many soldiers and nurses and surgeons became very ill indeed, and so we did our best to find out what was causing this mystery illness. And some of the nurses noticed that many beds were fatal. That is to say that if a soldier slept in a bed near the toilet, they became very ill indeed. And we realized that it was because they were breathing in poisonous gases. I strongly believe no man should die alone, and that every soldier should be cared for. And so I would walk the wards late at night when it was pitch black, and I would use a lamp to light my path. And that is why they call me Lady with the Lamp. I would walk for hours, making sure that every soldier was looked after. I would talk to them, sit with them, keep them company, and help them write letters home. I was very kind to them, and they were very kind to me in return. On July the 16th in 1856, the last patient left the barrack hospital, but my work was not over. When I returned to England, I was determined to forever change the way patients were cared for. Every patient deserves first-rate care. And I was also determined to change the way soldiers were treated. Before the war, soldiers were seen and treated as the scum of the earth. But my work changed all that. And soldiers were seen as a symbol of courage, loyalty, and endurance. I was also determined to change the way nurses were treated. And so nurses would no longer be seen as the lazy individuals, but as incredibly hard-working and kind. But when I returned from the Crimea, I was blighted by ill health, and although I never made a public appearance, I continued my work from home. I wrote notes on nursing, what it is and what it is not, and I also created detailed plans of how hospitals should be set out. And, of course, I created the first ever school for nursing.